hope for an early defeat of Russia. Now was the time to ensure the outcome. They saw as their instrument Lenin, leader of the Bolshevik group among the Russian revolutionaries. Lenin had spent the war years quietly in Switzerland with his wife, Krupskaya. The Germans had so far made little contact with them, finding other revolutionaries more cooperative. Lenin himself was no pro-German. Pitilessly single-minded, he saw all the warring nations as capitalist imperialists. He wanted peace and worldwide revolution against capitalism. As late as January 1917, he had said,
"We of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battle of this coming revolution."
When revolution in fact came only 2 months later, he was unimpressed.
The militant monarchy in Russia has been followed by a militant republic. A republic of capitalists who want to continue the imperialist war and to adhere to the robber treaties of the Tsarist monarchy.
Lenin's belief in peace at any price was at variance with both the Petrograd Soviet and even many Bolsheviks. Now, in Churchill's words, the Germans transported Lenin like a plague bacillus from Switzerland into Russia. He arrived in Petrograd on April the 16th, determined to capture control of the revolution. But his moment was not quite yet. The man of the moment was Kerensky. Unlike Lenin, this socialist lawyer, a compelling orator, honest, shrewd, energetic, wanted to continue the war. Kerensky's efforts to reinvigorate Russian society in defense of the revolution against German imperialism found a response among the Petrograd crowds. A freedom loan, launched to support the revolution, had a great success. Patriotic fellow socialists from allied countries, like the French socialist minister Albert Thomas, were welcomed on goodwill visits to cement allied solidarity. Thomas was tremendously impressed. With eyes sparkling as he glanced about him, he said to the French ambassador,
"Now we see the revolution in all its grandeur and beauty. The whole strength of the Russian democracy lies in its revolutionary fervor. Kerensky alone is capable of establishing, with the aid of the Soviet, a government worthy of confidence."
Soon, Kerensky was Minister of War in a new government, which included members of the Soviet. And with dynamic confidence, he went ahead with his plans for the Russian army's summer campaign. As in 1916, it was to take place in Galicia. But in the army, the virus of revolution had spread. The cracks in discipline were widening. An English observer wrote,
"Desertion had set in wholesale. In very few cases did the men leave the front trenches, but as soon as they were moved into the reserve, they decamped in a body. The movement was something elemental. They packed even the roofs of the railway carriages. A photograph of such a scene was published in England under the title, 'Russian Soldiers Hasten to the Front.'"
The Germans purposely left the front inactive to encourage this crumbling of Russian discipline. General Brusilov, victor of last year's campaign, had to spend hours arguing with soldiers, delegates, and committees who had their own strategic ideas. However, Brusilov was optimistic. So was Kerensky, who issued the order of the day.
"I call on the army, fortified by the strength and spirit of the revolution, to take the offensive."
Kerensky's offensive was launched on July the 1st. There were some initial gains. The Provisional Government issued an intoxicating communique.
July 1st has shown to the whole world the might of a revolutionary army. organized on democratic lines and inspired by a firm belief in the ideas of the revolution.
It was a pipe dream. After a few days of partial breakthroughs, the Russian offensive petered out. The British military attaché reported
they had lost many of their officers and had no incentive to further effort. In fact, they knew they could retire without fear of being punished. As a Russian artillery general expressed it, they felt lonely out in front and went back to their dugouts to sleep.
Then the Germans and Austrians counterattacked. The rout of the Russian army was overwhelming. The real meaning of the revolution now made itself felt. It had meant a breakdown not just of the Tsarist regime, but of Russia herself. Solitary, helpless, and dismayed, the individual Russian was looking for direction. This was a chaos which anyone might exploit, provided he was ruthless and single-minded enough. Lenin was such a man. He attacked the Provisional Government continually, and when the news of the disasters at the front reached Petrograd, it seemed that his moment had come. Crowds poured into the streets, calling for peace, bread, and freedom, and for the overthrow of the Provisional Government. To foment an armed uprising, the Bolsheviks called in the sailors from the naval base at Kronstadt. Everything now depended on the loyalty of the army. An observer wrote,
"Looking onto the square, I saw an endless multitude packing the entire space as far as the eye could reach. A mass of placards and banners with the Bolshevik slogans rose above the crowd. In the left-hand corner of the square, the black, ugly masses of armored cars loomed up."
A French correspondent reported,
Suddenly, a shot rang out. Whence had it come from? By whom and against whom had it been fired? Nobody seemed to know. But it was immediately followed by other shots, which soon increased to a wild fusillade, dominated by the sinister rattle of the machine guns. The bullets whizzed through the wildly fleeing crowd.
the army stood by the Provisional Government, and when it was announced that the Bolsheviks had been receiving funds from German sources, Lenin had to flee to Finland on a forged passport. Other Bolsheviks, including Trotsky, were briefly arrested. General Kornilov, the commander-in-chief, was not satisfied with the government's efforts to restore order and continue the war. With his troops, he began a march on Petrograd. But Kerensky, afraid of being branded as a counter-revolutionary, refused to accept his support. He even enlisted Bolshevik aid to stop Kornilov, and thus armed his worst enemies. Trotsky set about drilling the workers into a Bolshevik armed force, the Red Guard. They were to act as shock troops when the moment came for the Bolsheviks to strike. And that moment was now not far off. The Germans did their best to hasten it. They launched an offensive in the north towards Petrograd, turning the Russian flank above Riga by an amphibious landing, on an island in the Gulf of Finland. Hindenburg described